This submodule of the course is on Aristotle's theory of friendship from books 8 and 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics. This current video is an introduction tying Aristotle's theory of friendship to what's come before in the text. The next one will cover the three main types of friendships, which are friendships of pleasure, friendships of utility, and friendships of virtue. And finally, the third video in this sub-module will cover self-love, friendship with oneself. So to start talking about Aristotle's theory of friendship, we need to go back to his definition of the human person as a rational and political animal. If we think about the virtues, especially prudence or practical wisdom, reason determines the mean for every virtue. So that means, in terms of being a rational animal, that we don't just have the ability to use reason to know, to theorize and think through things. We also have the ability, as rational animals, to use reason to guide action. But now Aristotle is going to take a close look at what he means by saying that human beings are political animals. And we have to remember that his term political doesn't really refer to what we talk about as politics. It has more to do with the fact that we're socialized animals, we're social animals, and we tend to organize our lives into relationships. And so Aristotle's theory of friendship has a lot to do with how to organize our social life and our social relationships to achieve happiness, that distinctively human thriving. And another way of putting that point is Aristotle is asking what kind of relationships will cause us to be human persons who are fully alive. Now we can start with the obvious point that having relationships of hatred, having enemies, isn't good for us. They take something away from our happiness. We want relationships that contribute something positively to our lives. Now, Aristotle doesn't mention the next point, but sometimes having a clear enemy can give us an important sense of direction in our lives or some part of our lives. But it's still the case that positive relationships should predominate in our lives. And Aristotle's word for that kind of social relationship is a friendship. Now, that means that Aristotle's category of friendship is actually somewhat broader than our category of friendship. It's going to include certain things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as friendship, and I'll highlight those as we go along. But this is a specific point of a general one, that whenever a philosopher picks up a common word, he or she probably doesn't mean exactly what we mean by it when we ordinarily use it. And that's because philosophers are always trying to make our thinking more precise. A big part of that is teaching us to use language more mindfully. So you want to watch and see when Aristotle's word friendship overlaps with what you mean by it and when it differs. And those places where it differs are where you can really learn from Aristotle about how to fulfill your social and political nature. That is, you can learn something that you don't already know. Now, as a background, we need to talk about what Aristotle calls unequal friendships. And this is one of the places where Aristotle's use of the word friendship differs from ours. His central example is what he calls the friendship between parents and their children. Now, we don't normally call that a friendship, but Aristotle does. And it's because it's a social relationship that contributes positively to our happiness. At least it does that when it functions as it should. And we know, of course, that it doesn't always function as it should. Aristotle's point about unequal friendships, like the parent-child relationship, is a really interesting one. The parent gives life to the child. Years of food, clothing, shelter, massive financial support, attention, hopefully some moral education too. It would not make sense if, when we turn 21, our parents would hand us an invoice. Okay, we've spent this much on your food. You owe us this much rent. We spent this much on your health care. We've paid this much for your clothing, for your education. We spent X number of hours of attention on you. And so at the market rate of X dollars an hour, whatever it is that your parents' time is worth or they think it's worth, here's what you owe us for the first 21 years of your life. And of course, ultimately, it would not make any sense for us to ask our parents to give them life when they've given us life. Now, I'm deliberately making this ridiculous to emphasize Aristotle's point. It's actually impossible to pay parents back, and it would be wrong for a parent to ask us to pay them back for everything they've invested in us, and it would be silly for us to try because of that impossibility. So Aristotle's claim is we don't owe our parents dollars and hours. We owe our parents honor and respect in return for what they've given us. This is part of what makes the relationship an unequal friendship for Aristotle, the fact that there's an utter impossibility for us to pay back what our parents have given us in the same currency, so to speak, in which they've given us. And it's very interesting, I think, that respect or honor your father and your mother is one of the 10 Commandments. And in this way, early Judaism and Aristotle coincide, even though there's no connection historically between Aristotle and early Judaism. They come up with the same idea, so this is probably something like a universal truth, at least universal for human beings, that we realize that we should honor our mothers and our fathers. And in fact, I think we can see the depth of Aristotle's point if we consider that it's probably impossible for any of us to own our own identity fully without honoring what we carry from our parents throughout our lives. Now, it's somewhat different if our parents are not good human beings. Aristotle doesn't address that point directly, but his principle probably holds true there, just in a different sense. We may decide, for instance, to live in a way that explicitly rejects some of the principles that our parents lived by. But we still take some of their tendencies and some of their life experiences with us, some of their personalities, in fact, even if we decide to do something very different with them to build an entirely different life out of those same materials. Now, I don't know if that amounts to honoring or respecting our parents, but at least it means not denying where we came from, not denying who our parents are. And most of us, however different that relationship with our parents is, or however difficult that relationship with our parents is, can still identify positive features of their lives, things that they gave us, and lessons that we learned from them. So to wrap up and review a little bit this introductory lecture on Aristotle's chapters on friendship, in what Aristotle writes about friendship, the question he wants to pose is, what kinds of social relationships do we need in order to live out our lives as fully as possible? In other words, to thrive as the social and political animals that we are.